They told me my Sarah was taken by Apaches. They lied. Her diary tells the true story of betrayal. Now I walk a path of vengeance for the woman who should have been my wife. I was once Josiah Cain, a hopeful man, a faithful man. Now I am simply the shadow that follows those who destroyed my Sarah. 15 years is a long time to grieve. It is an even longer time to discover your grief was built on lies. The year was 1877 when I last saw Sarah alive. Her golden hair, catching the morning light, her blue eyes filled with promise. She told me she would meet me in Prescott in 3 weeks' time. She told me she was looking forward to becoming Mrs. Cain. I told her I would count the days until we were reunited. We parted with a gentle kiss and the certainty of our future together. Sarah never arrived. I never became a husband. And for 15 years, I believed a story woven by men who thought their secret would remain buried forever in the Arizona dust. I was born and raised in Boston to a family of modest means. My father was a carpenter. My mother tended our home. We were not wealthy, but we were honest. They raised me to believe that a man is only as good as his word. That honor is not a luxury, but a necessity. By the age of 20, I had apprenticed under my father and learned to transform raw lumber into things of beauty and function. I could look at a piece of oak and see the table it would become. I could run my hands over pine and feel the cradle waiting to be released from within. I believed I understood potential and possibility. In the spring of 1875, my cousin Robert wrote to me from the Arizona Territory. He told me that Prescott was growing. He told me that a skilled carpenter could make a fortune building homes for the influx of settlers. He told me there was opportunity in the West that the East could never provide. I was young, I was ambitious. I packed my tools and headed west with dreams of establishing my own carpentry business. The journey was long, but my spirits remained high. I would build a life first, then I would find someone to share it with. Prescott was smaller than Boston, but alive with energy and promise. The sound of construction filled the air from dawn until dusk. The smell of sawdust and opportunity was intoxicating. I found lodging with Robert and secured work the very next day. Within a year, I had saved enough to purchase land on the edge of town. I built a modest home with my own hands. 3 rooms with a covered porch and windows that caught the morning light. I added special touches that revealed my skill. Carved moldings, a solid oak door with brass fittings, a kitchen with built-in cabinets that would make any woman proud. It was while purchasing supplies at Henderson Mercantile that I first saw Sarah Collins. She was selecting fabric with her aunt. The sunlight through the windows turned her hair to spun gold. She had a quiet grace that made the room seem still, despite the bustle of customers. Mrs. Henderson saw me staring and made introductions. Sarah had arrived from Illinois just 2 months prior. She was staying with her aunt and uncle until she decided whether the Arizona Territory would be her permanent home. She told me she was considering a position as a school teacher. I told her I was a carpenter. She smiled and said she had always appreciated fine craftsmanship. That evening I returned home and began carving a small wooden box. I worked through the night. My hands knew what to create even before my mind had fully formed the idea. By morning, I had fashioned a delicate container with a lid that featured a carved wild rose. I lined it with scraps of velvet. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it was made specifically for her. When I presented it to Sarah the following Sunday after church services, her eyes widened with delight. She told me it was the finest gift she had ever received. I told her I would like permission to call on her properly. Her aunt nodded approval, and so began our courtship. Sarah was 22, educated, thoughtful. She had come west after the death of her parents left her with a modest inheritance and a desire for a fresh beginning. She was neither fragile nor hardened by her loss. She carried it with dignity. She spoke of her mother and father with love rather than sorrow. We walked together through Prescott in the evenings. We attended social gatherings where she charmed everyone with her piano playing. I showed her the home I had built and watched her eyes assess its potential. She told me she could envision children running through the rooms. I told her I hoped they would have her golden hair and kind spirit. After 6 months of courtship, I asked for her hand in marriage. We were sitting on the porch of her aunt and uncle's home. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. She said yes, before I had even finished my proposal. We embraced as her aunt cried happy tears from the doorway. Our wedding was set for June 15th, 1877. Sarah decided she wanted to retrieve some family heirlooms from Illinois before the ceremony. Items that had belonged to her mother, a locket, a Bible, a set of silver that had been in her family for generations. I offered to accompany her, but there was a large commission I could not postpone. The territorial governor had requested custom furnishings for his new offices. It was the kind of prestigious work that would establish my reputation throughout the territory. Sarah told me she understood. She told me she was perfectly capable of making the journey with the right guide. Her uncle introduced her to a man named Elias Thornton. He had made the journey between Illinois and Arizona territory multiple times. He knew the safest routes. He had a reputation for reliability. He charged a fair price for his services. I met him only once before their departure. He was tall, with a weathered face and calloused hands. He spoke with confidence about the journey. He assured me he would deliver my bride to be safely to Prescott by the first week of June. I believed him. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. Sarah and Thornton departed eastward on April 23rd. I waved until their wagon disappeared from view. The last image I have of my beloved is her white handkerchief fluttering in the breeze as she waved goodbye. I returned to my workshop with plans to complete the governor's commission and prepare our home for married life. I received one letter from Sarah while she was in Illinois. She told me she had collected the family treasures she sought. She told me she had visited her parents' graves one final time. She told me she was at peace with leaving her past behind and embracing our future together. She told me they would begin the return journey on May 10th. I calculated the days in my head. They should arrive in Prescott by the 1st or 2nd of June. Plenty of time before our wedding day. I began counting down the days like a child, awaiting Christmas morning. June 1st came and went, with no sign of Sarah or Thornton. I told myself delays were common on such journeys. Weather, mechanical issues with wagons, minor illnesses that required rest. I focused on putting final touches on our home. By June 5th, worry had settled in my chest like a stone. I spoke with Sarah's uncle, who suggested I inquire with the stagecoach company that served the eastern route. They reported no unusual conditions that would cause significant delays. No reports of bandits or Apache activity. On June 8th, I organized a small search party. 4 men, including myself, rode east along the route Sarah and Thornton should have taken. We traveled for 2 days before we came upon the remains of a wagon near Devil's Canyon. The wood was charred. Personal items scattered across the rocky ground. The bodies of 2 mules still in their harnesses, their flesh picked clean by scavengers. My heart nearly stopped when I found a familiar piece of blue fabric caught on a mesquite bush. The same shade as the traveling dress Sarah had worn when she departed. One of the men found arrows embedded in what remained of the wagon. Apache arrows. The territorial marshal who joined our search party examined the scene with a grim expression. He told me this had all the markings of an Apache attack. He told me they rarely left survivors. He told me they sometimes took women captive, but that such a fate was worse than death. He suggested we return to Prescott and report the incident to the military. I refused to leave without confirmation of Sarah's fate. We searched for 2 more days, found nothing but scorched earth and silence. No sign of Sarah or Thornton among the dead, no trail to follow. The marshal insisted we turn back. He told me there was nothing more to be done. He told me I must accept that my betrothed was gone. Upon our return to Prescott, military officials recorded the incident. They told me they would include it in their reports of Apache hostilities. They told me such attacks were tragically common. They told me I should focus on rebuilding my life. I existed in a state of disbelief. I drank heavily. I neglected my business. I woke each morning expecting to find it had all been a terrible dream. Sarah's aunt fell ill from grief. Her uncle avoided my gaze when we passed in the street. The community offered condolences, then gradually stopped mentioning her name. Twice I attempted to organize larger search parties to comb the territory. Few men would join me. Those who did seemed to do so out of pity rather than hope. We found nothing, no trace of Sarah, no confirmation of her death, no evidence to contradict the Apache attack theory. As months passed, my grief hardened into something darker. I began visiting Apache camps under the guise of selling woodwork. I learned phrases of their language. I showed a sketch of Sarah and asked if anyone had seen her. Most turned away. Some spat on the ground. One elder told me through a translator that his people had not attacked any wagons in that area during that season. I took this information to the territorial authorities. They dismissed it as an attempt by the Apache to avoid punishment. They told me the evidence was clear. They told me to go home and move forward with my life. They told me my behavior was becoming obsessive and unhealthy. Perhaps they were right, but something in my soul rejected the official explanation. I could not articulate why. It was nothing more than instinct, a sense that the story was incomplete, that crucial details remained hidden. The one person who might have provided answers had also vanished. Elias Thornton never returned to Prescott. I asked about him in neighboring communities. No one had seen him since he departed with Sarah. Most assumed he had died in the same attack. Some suggested he had fought bravely to protect my bride before being overwhelmed. He was regarded as another victim of frontier violence. As the first anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached, I made a decision. I would follow their entire route. I would speak to every person they might have encountered on their journey. I would trace their path from Illinois back to the site of the attack. I would find the truth or I would die trying. I sold my business. I sold the home I had built for us. I kept only my tools, my horse, and the small wooden box I had created for Sarah. She had left it behind, planning to fill it with her mother's jewelry upon her return. It remained empty, a vessel of promise never fulfilled. For 15 years I wandered, 15 years of searching, asking questions, following whispers and rumors, sleeping under stars and in shabby hotels, working odd jobs to fund my quest, learning to track, learning to survive in the wilderness, learning that the West conceals its secrets beneath layers of dust and lies. I became a ghost. A man without roots or future. The only constant was my determination to understand what had happened. To the woman I loved, my beard grew long, my skin darkened under the relentless sun, my eyes developed the distant gaze of a man who has looked too long at horizons. 15 years is a long time to chase shadows. 15 years of following trails that grew cold. 15 years of nightmares featuring Sarah calling my name as she disappeared into darkness. 15 years of returning to Devil's Canyon and searching for something I had missed. People stopped taking me seriously. They saw a man broken by grief, a cautionary tale of obsession. Sarah's aunt died. Her uncle moved to California. Prescott grew and changed. New buildings stood where I remembered empty lots. New faces replaced familiar ones. I became a stranger in the place I had once called home. I tried normal life twice during those years. Once I stayed in Tucson for 6 months, built furniture for a hotel, courted a widow with kind eyes, but each time I looked at her I saw only who she was not. Each time she spoke, I heard only the absence of Sarah's voice. I left one morning before dawn, left a note apologizing for my inability to love her as she deserved. The second attempt at normalcy lasted nearly a year. I worked as a guide for geological survey teams near Flagstaff. The routine was soothing, the physical labor exhausting enough to grant dreamless sleep. I saved money, considered purchasing land, even attended social gatherings where young women cast hopeful glances my way. Then I overheard a conversation about a massacre near Devil's Canyon years earlier. The details were wrong, the date was wrong, but it reopened all my questions. I abandoned the job the next day and rode south. My obsession resumed its hold on my soul. I consulted shamans and medicine men from various tribes. Most turned me away. Some took my money and told me what I wanted to hear. One Apache elder looked into my eyes for a long time before speaking. He told me I was following a crooked path. He told me the truth I sought was not in the place I had been looking. He told me to let the land itself speak to me. His words made little sense at the time, but they returned to me last month as I stood once again at the edge of Devil's Canyon. 15 years to the day since I had found the burned wagon. I was 50 years old, my hair and beard more grey than brown, my quest no closer to resolution than it had been on day one. I sat on a boulder and watched the sunset paint the canyon walls. I felt a weariness beyond physical exhaustion, a soul, deep fatigue. For the first time I considered the possibility of surrender, of accepting that some mysteries remain unsolved, of allowing Sarah to rest and myself to live whatever years remained to me. As darkness fell, I prepared to make camp, to spend one final night in this place of loss before riding away forever. The wind picked up, desert sounds surrounded me, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of sand across stone. Something caught my attention, a sound that did not belong, a rhythmic tapping coming from the canyon wall. I approached with my lantern held high. The sound grew louder, tap, 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 like stone against stone. I followed it to a narrow crevice in the rock face, a crevice I had passed dozens of times over, the years without noticing. The wind flowed through it, creating the tapping sound as it moved loose stones. I squeezed through the opening, found myself in a narrow passage that twisted deeper into the earth. The air was cool and damp. The passage showed signs of having partially collapsed years ago. This was not a natural formation, but the remains of a mine shaft, one that had been abandoned and forgotten, one that even the local Apache avoided according to the markings scratched near the entrance. I proceeded carefully, my lantern casting long shadows on walls that dripped with moisture. The passage widened into a small chamber, and there I found something that stopped my breath. A saddle, weathered and cracked but still recognizable. Saddlebag still attached. The leather stiff with age. Not remarkable in itself. Miners often brought horses into the early sections of shafts, but this particular saddle bore initials tooled into the leather. E.T. Elias Thornton. My hands trembled as I opened the saddlebags. Inside, I found a canteen, a rusted knife, a pouch of tobacco turned to dust, and something wrapped in oilcloth, something protected from the elements and hidden with care. I unwrapped it slowly, revealed a small book bound in faded red leather, the pages yellowed but intact. I opened it and nearly dropped my lantern when I saw the handwriting on the first page. Handwriting I would recognize until my dying day. Sarah Collins, May 1st, 1877. It was her diary, the diary she had kept during her journey, the diary that would change everything I thought I knew about her disappearance. I sat in that cave until dawn, reading by lantern light, turning pages with careful fingers, absorbing every word, every revelation, every horror. By the time I emerged into the morning light, I was no longer the man who had entered. I was transformed by truth, transformed by rage, transformed by purpose. Sarah had not died at Apache hands. She had been betrayed, sold, trafficked, her fate sealed by the very man entrusted with her safe passage, and by others whose names filled her desperate entries, men who now lived respectable lives in Prescott and beyond, men who believed their secret had died with her. I mounted my horse and rode west, not as a seeker anymore, but as an avenger, the diary secure against my chest, my mind clear for the first time in 15 years. I knew exactly what needed to be done, exactly who needed to pay, exactly how I would dismantle their lives as they had destroyed Sarah's. I did not ride directly to Prescott. I knew better than to act on raw emotion. Vengeance required planning, precision, patience. The men responsible for Sarah's fate had enjoyed 15 years of freedom. They would wait a few months more while I prepared. I traveled to Tucson, found lodging in a boarding house on the outskirts of town. I needed anonymity while I gathered information and resources. I grew a fuller beard, purchased new clothing, adopted the persona of James Williams, a rancher looking to invest in businesses. No one connected me to Josiah Kane, the carpenter who had lost his bride 15 years earlier. Each night I read Sarah's diary again, committed every detail to memory, the names, the places, the sequence of events. Her words painted a picture so different from what I had believed. She and Thornton had reached Illinois safely, had collected her family heirlooms, had begun the return journey as planned. 3 days out of Illinois, they encountered 2 men on the trail, men Thornton seemed to know, men who joined their small party despite Sarah's discomfort. Her entries grew increasingly anxious as the journey continued. She wrote of overhearing whispered conversations, of Thornton's changing demeanor, of the way the men watched her when they thought she was asleep, of her growing certainty that something was wrong. On May 28th, they made camp near a small settlement in New Mexico territory. Sarah attempted to seek help from a local family. Thornton intercepted her, accused her of hysteria, convinced the settlers that she was his mentally unwell sister being transported to family in Arizona territory. That night he bound her hands, told her the truth. She was not being escorted to her wedding. She was being delivered to a man named Victor Holloway, who ran establishments of ill repute throughout the territory. Establishments that catered to men with particular tastes, men who would pay handsomely for an educated, genteel woman. A woman whose disappearance would be blamed on Apache raiders. The final entries documented their approach to Devil's Canyon, Sarah's desperate escape attempt, her flight into the canyon with the diary hidden in her dress, the sound of men pursuing her, her discovery of the abandoned mine shaft, her decision to hide deep within its passages, the collapse that trapped her inside, the dwindling light of her small candle, the acceptance of her fate. Her final words were a declaration of love for me and a prayer that somehow, someday, the truth would be known. My Sarah had died alone in darkness, not by Apache arrows, but by the greed and depravity of men who saw her as merchandise, men who had staged an attack to cover their actions, men who had planted evidence to support their fabrication, men who had returned to their lives unburdened by consequence. I opened a bank account in Tucson with the money I had saved over 15 years. I purchased supplies, a new rifle, ammunition, a knife of exceptional quality, maps of the territory. I spent hours at the Territorial Records Office researching property ownership, business licenses, tax payments. I learned that Elias Thornton now owned a successful stagecoach company operating between Prescott and Phoenix. He had 3 offices, a fine home, a wife and 2 children. He was considered a pillar of the community, a man who had built his fortune through hard work and determination. Victor Holloway owned saloons and hotels in Prescott, Phoenix, and Tucson. Establishments with legitimate public faces and hidden back rooms where merchandise of all kinds changed hands. He had connections with territorial officials. His name appeared in newspaper accounts of charity events and civic improvements. The two men who had joined them on the trail were brothers, Samuel and William Porter. Samuel now served as a deputy marshal in Prescott. William managed one of Holloway's establishments. Both had families, respectable positions, community standing. These four men had constructed lives of comfort and respect upon the foundation of my Sarah's suffering. They had prospered while I wandered. They had created families while mine had been stolen. They had slept peacefully while I was tortured by uncertainty. The final component of my preparation involved visiting Apache camps once again. Not to ask questions this time, but to learn, to understand how they moved silently through the landscape, how they tracked prey across seemingly impossible terrain, how they utilized patience as a weapon. An elderly medicine man took interest in my quest. He never asked why I sought such knowledge, never questioned the darkness he surely saw in my eyes. He simply taught, and I learned, techniques for moving undetected, for observing without being observed, for using the environment itself as both weapon and shield. By late July, I was ready. I had information, skills, resources, and most importantly, a plan for each man, a plan that would not end with quick death, but with prolonged destruction. They would lose everything, status, family, freedom, future, just as I had lost mine 15 years before. I returned to Prescott on August 1st, 1892. I rented rooms above a print shop on a side street. I visited the barber, trimmed my beard to a respectable length, purchased the clothing of a successful businessman, created the appearance of James Williams, investor and entrepreneur. No one recognized Josiah Kane in my features. No one connected me to the lovesick carpenter who had searched for his missing bride. 15 years had changed me beyond recognition. Grief and purpose had transformed me into someone new, someone dangerous, someone patient. I spent 2 weeks observing their patterns, learning their routines, identifying their weaknesses. Thornton visited the same restaurant every Wednesday evening. Holloway attended church with his family every Sunday. Deputy Porter patrolled the same route through town each night. William Porter managed the card tables at Holloway's largest saloon. 4 men, 4 carefully crafted lives, 4 reputations about to collapse. I would begin with Thornton, the betrayer, the man who had looked me in the eye and promised to deliver Sarah safely, the man who had sold her like cattle, the man whose actions had set everything in motion. I would end with Holloway, the spider at the center of the web, the man who had created the demand that Sarah was meant to fulfill, the architect of a network that continued to destroy lives while he accepted accolades from society. In between, the Porter brothers would learn that participation carries the same penalty as initiation, that following orders does not absolve guilt, that 15 years is not long enough to escape justice. I made final preparations, secured additional rooms in a boarding house near the edge of town under a different name, established escape routes, cached supplies at strategic locations outside Prescott, created contingency plans for every possible complication. On the evening of August 15th, I sat in my rented room and opened Sarah's diary one final time, read her words by lamplight, touched the pages her hand had touched, whispered a promise that by the time the first snow fell on Prescott, all 4 men would have paid for their crimes. I did not pray for courage. I did not seek divine permission. I simply acknowledged what I had become. A weapon forged in the fire of prolonged grief, an instrument of retribution, a man with nothing to lose and only one purpose remaining. The next morning, I began. Elias Thornton kept an office above his stagecoach company. He arrived each morning at precisely 8:30. He took lunch at 1. He departed at 6, unless there was a special shipment arriving. On Wednesdays, he dined with business associates at the Grand Hotel. On Sundays, he attended church with his family, then spent the afternoon at home. I approached him as James Williams, a businessman interested in investing in transportation ventures, sent a letter requesting a meeting, received a prompt response inviting me to his office the following day. He had aged well. His hair was silver, at the temples, his clothing expensive but tasteful, his office appointed with items that displayed his success. A large desk of polished mahogany, paintings of stagecoaches on the walls, a cabinet containing bottles of fine whiskey. He did not recognize me. Why would he? We had met only once, 15 years earlier. I was a different man now. I smiled, shook his hand, accepted the offered seat and whiskey, discussed potential investment opportunities with appropriate enthusiasm. As our meeting concluded, I mentioned my interest in the history of the region, asked about his early days in the territory, watched his face carefully as he spoke of building his business from nothing, of the challenges of establishing roots through Apache territory, of his commitment to passenger safety. I allowed my expression to sharpen slightly. I asked if he recalled a particular incident from 1877, a young woman traveling from Illinois to her wedding in Prescott, a woman who never arrived, a woman named Sarah Collins. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a momentary freeze before he resumed his pleasant demeanor. He told me he vaguely remembered something about an Apache attack, a tragedy among many in those dangerous times. He suggested I speak with the Historical Society if I was researching frontier violence. I smiled, thanked him for his time, left. My card with promises to continue our discussion about investment opportunities. Walked out of his office knowing I had seen the face of a man confronting a ghost. That evening I visited the Prescott Herald newspaper office, spoke with the editor about placing a series of advertisements for my investment business, casually mentioned historical research I was conducting, asked if I might look through their archives from 1877. The editor was happy to assist a potential advertiser. I found what I sought. The brief article about the attack near Devil's Canyon, the mention of Sarah Collins as the victim, the quotations from territorial authorities about Apache hostilities, and most importantly, the names of those who had provided information about the incident. Elias Thornton was prominently featured, described as the sole survivor who had fought valiantly but been unable to save the young woman in his care. The next morning, a new advertisement appeared in the Herald, a notice seeking information about the Devil's Canyon incident of 1877, a substantial reward offered for details not previously reported, my name and temporary address included for responses. Simultaneously, I sent letters to 3 competing stagecoach companies, introduced myself as an investor looking to expand transportation options in the territory, suggested meetings to discuss their operations and challenges, inquired specifically about their experiences with Thornton's Stagecoach Company. By week's end, the pieces were in motion. I received responses to my advertisement. Most were worthless. Fortune seekers inventing details for reward money, but 2 had potential. A former cavalry officer who questioned the attribution to Apaches, a settler who remembered seeing Thornton with companions not mentioned in official reports. I met with representatives from the competing stagecoach companies, listened to their complaints about Thornton's business practices, his undercutting of prices, his mysterious ability to secure exclusive contracts with territorial offices, his connections to influential men including Victor Holloway and Deputy Marshal Samuel Porter. On Sunday, I attended church services, observed Thornton with his family, his wife elegant in a blue dress, his teenage son and daughter beside him, his expression serene as the minister spoke of truth and righteousness. I sat 3 rows behind them, close enough to see the grey in his wife's hair, close enough to hear his daughter's quiet singing, close enough to contemplate the symmetry of destroying his family as he had destroyed mine. The following Wednesday, I dined at the Grand Hotel, positioned myself at a table with clear view of Thornton and his associates, one of whom was Victor Holloway. They spoke in low voices, laughed occasionally, conducted business over expensive steaks and wine. I observed the easy camaraderie of men who shared secrets, who trusted in their collective protection. That night, I wrote 7 letters, enclosed portions of Sarah's diary in each, specific entries that documented Thornton's role in her abduction and planned sale. I sent these letters to strategic recipients: the territorial governor, the editor of the Herald, the head of the Merchants Association, Thornton's most significant business competitors, his banker, his minister, and finally, to his wife. I did not include my name, did not reveal the diaries. Discovery simply presented the evidence of his crime and suggested that further investigation was warranted, that perhaps the Apache attack narrative deserved reconsideration. The impact was not immediately visible. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public accusations. But within days, the whispers began. Thornton was seen arguing with his banker. On the street, his wife did not accompany him to church the following Sunday. The Territorial Marshal's office announced a review of historical cases involving Apache attacks. I continued my campaign quietly, provided additional diary excerpts to those who seemed most responsive to the initial information, arranged for the former cavalry officer to speak with the Herald editor about inconsistencies in the original attack report, encouraged Thornton's business competitors to raise questions about the source of his initial capital. 3 weeks after my first letter, Thornton's world began to visibly crumble. His wife left their home with their daughter. The bank initiated a review of his business loans. The Merchants Association requested his temporary withdrawal pending investigation of serious allegations. The territorial governor cancelled contracts with his stagecoach company. I observed his deterioration from a careful distance, the increasing dishevelment of his appearance, the desperate meetings with associates who gradually stopped acknowledging him in public, the afternoon visits to saloons that extended into evening. His son remained loyal initially, defended his father against growing rumors, managed the stagecoach office as customers dwindled. But even filial devotion has limits. After receiving an anonymous package containing his father's detailed correspondence with Holloway regarding the acquisition and transportation of women, the young man departed on the eastbound stage. Thornton was alone, his reputation destroyed, his business failing, his family gone, but physical freedom remained. This was intentional. I wanted him cornered but not captured, available for the final phase of my plan. It came 6 weeks after my arrival in Prescott. Thornton's remaining friends had abandoned him. His home had been seized by creditors. He slept in his office and drank steadily through each day. The territorial marshal had issued a summons for his testimony regarding multiple historical cases. Now under review, I sent him a note, suggested a meeting at his office to discuss a potential resolution to his troubles. Signed it with a name he would recognize instantly, Josiah Kane. He was waiting when I arrived, unshaven, bleary-eyed, a pistol on his desk beside a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He looked at me with narrowed eyes, seeking the young carpenter he had met briefly 15 years earlier, finding instead the instrument of his destruction. I placed Sarah's diary on his desk, watched recognition dawn in his rheumy eyes. He reached for the pistol. I made no move to stop him, but rather than point it at me, he placed the barrel against his own temple. I told him suicide was too merciful. I told him I had arranged for his capture and trial. I told him witnesses had been located, Evidence secured. Accomplices persuaded to testify against him. I told him he would spend his remaining years in territorial prison, that his name would become synonymous with treachery, that the complete account of his crimes would follow his family wherever they settled. He pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. I'd replaced his ammunition with spent cartridges while he was drinking at the saloon the previous evening. I wanted him alive to face justice, to endure public shame, to experience powerlessness similar to what Sarah had felt. He lunged across the desk, fingers curved into claws, face contorted with hatred and fear. I stepped aside easily, watched him stumble and fall, the once proud businessman reduced to a cornered animal. I left the diary on his desk, left him sobbing on the floor, left the office and walked calmly into the street. The territorial marshal and his deputies arrested Thornton that evening. The charges included kidnapping, trafficking, conspiracy, fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. His remaining defiance crumbled when confronted with Sarah's diary and supporting documentation I had carefully gathered. In exchange for leniency, he provided testimony against his associates, detailed the operation that had claimed Sarah and other women, named Victor Holloway as the architect, implicated the Porter brothers as facilitators, revealed the location of records documenting 15 years of criminal enterprise. I watched his public disgrace from the boardwalk across from the marshal's office, watched him led away in shackles, watched the crowd that had gathered to witness the downfall of a man they had respected. Among them were Samuel Porter and Victor Holloway, their expressions a mixture of shock and calculation. Unaware that their own reckonings approached, Samuel Porter increased his patrol activities, carried an additional sidearm, requested assistance from other deputies when investigating disturbances. The protective instincts of a man who recognizes his vulnerability. Victor Holloway began selling properties, transferring assets, preparing for swift departure if necessary, the survival strategy of a man accustomed to abandoning compromised positions. William Porter simply disappeared, vacated his rooms above. Holloway's saloon left no forwarding address, the desperate flight of a man who understands his expendability. I adjusted my plans accordingly. Samuel Porter would be next. His position as deputy marshal made him both a priority and a challenge. His access to official information, his legal authority, his armed presence. These required a different approach than I had used with Thornton. I would dismantle his professional credibility first, then his personal life, then deliver him to justice alongside his employer, all while continuing to track Holloway's movements and monitor his preparations for escape. I began with research, visited the Territorial Records Office again, requested documents relating to cases Deputy Porter had handled, identified patterns in his arrests, his testimony, his seizure of property from suspects, noted the frequency with which those properties later appeared in Holloway's possession. I cultivated relationships with courthouse clerks, expressed interest in legal processes as a businessman concerned with territorial stability, gained access to trial transcripts, discovered testimonies that had been altered after initial recording, signatures that differed subtly from document to document, evidence of manipulation that required official position to accomplish. I visited saloons frequented by other lawmen, purchased drinks, listened to conversations, gathered impressions of Deputy Porter from his colleagues, learned of suspicions never formally raised, of incidents explained away, of complaints dismissed without investigation. I approached Porter's former partners, men who had worked with him years earlier. Several had left law enforcement under curious circumstances. One agreed to meet privately outside town, shared stories of evidence that disappeared, of witnesses, pressured to change their accounts, of selective enforcement based on Holloway's interests. When my collection of information was complete, I composed a detailed report. Documented 23 cases showing clear misconduct, included sworn statements from former colleagues, attached financial records showing Porter's unexplained income, added excerpts from Sarah's diary that specifically named him as participant. In her planned abduction, I did not submit this report to the current marshal. His close association with Porter made him an unreliable recipient. Instead, I sent copies to the territorial governor, the federal marshal in Phoenix, the judge who presided over the most significant cases involved, and most importantly, to 3 newspaper editors in different communities. The response was swift. The federal marshal arrived from Phoenix with orders to investigate. Porter was suspended pending review. His home and office were searched, records seized, the case files I had identified pulled for examination. His colleagues questioned under oath. Porter maintained his innocence publicly, claimed persecution connected to Thornton's case, presented himself as a dedicated lawman targeted by criminals. But his performance lacked conviction. His eyes darted nervously during interviews. His hands trembled slightly when questioned about specific incidents. His wife stood beside him initially, echoed his claims of persecution, hosted gatherings to rally support from prominent citizens, wrote impassioned letters to officials vouching for his character. Her loyalty was admirable, but misplaced. A fact she discovered when federal agents found documentation of his other family in Tucson, a woman and 2 children he had been supporting for 8 years while traveling for official business. The betrayal shattered her public support of her husband. She filed for divorce 3 days after the discovery, refused him entry to their home, revealed additional information about unexplained income and late-night meetings with Holloway to investigators. Within 2 weeks of my initial report, Samuel Porter was formally charged with corruption, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, conspiracy related to trafficking. The solid, respectable life he had constructed disintegrated under scrutiny. He approached Holloway for assistance, for funds to secure legal representation, for use of connections to influence the proceedings. I observed their meeting from across the street, noted Holloway's dismissive gesture, his refusal to extend his hand to the desperate man, his swift departure in his private carriage. That night, Porter attempted to flee, packed essential belongings, withdrew his remaining funds from the bank, saddled his horse in darkness. He was apprehended at the edge of town by federal agents who had anticipated his flight. His capture was publicized in morning editions across the territory. His expression in the accompanying photograph was that of a man who recognized the inevitability of his downfall. Under intense questioning and facing substantial prison time, he followed Thornton's example, provided testimony against Holloway, detailed operations I had not yet uncovered, named associates throughout the territory, described the network that had claimed Sarah and countless others. 2 down. The third, William Porter, remained elusive. Reports placed him in California, then New Mexico territory, then heading toward Texas. His flight suggested he understood his fate if apprehended. He became a fugitive with his likeness, circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout the West. I did not pursue him personally. His role in Sarah's story had been secondary, a follower rather than a leader. His life was effectively destroyed regardless of his location, stripped of respectability, severed from family, consigned to perpetual flight. Justice of a different sort, but justice nonetheless. My focus shifted fully to Victor Holloway, the man who had created the market for women like Sarah, the architect of the operation that had treated human beings as commodities, the beneficiary of 15 years of suffering and exploitation. Holloway had begun consolidating his operations, selling peripheral properties, transferring funds to banks in San Francisco, sending his wife and children to relatives in the East, maintaining a facade of routine while clearly preparing for departure. He was more cautious than his associates, more insulated by layers of subordinates, more protected by wealth and connection. His name appeared in Sarah's diary, but always at a distance, as the destination rather than the captor, as the buyer rather than the transporter. He had maintained careful separation from direct action. This required a different approach, a strategy that would bind him irrefutably to the crimes, that would prevent his escape through legal technicalities or purchased influence, that would ensure his downfall was complete and irreversible. I needed access to his records, his correspondence, his financial documentation, the evidence of his direct involvement that surely existed somewhere in his possession, items he would destroy before fleeing if given the opportunity. I secured lodging in a building adjacent to his largest saloon and gaming house, the establishment that served as his operational headquarters. From my window I observed daily patterns, staff arrivals and departures, security procedures, Holloway's personal schedule when he visited the offices on the third floor. I cultivated a relationship with his head bartender, expressed interest in investing in similar establishments, hinted at significant capital and questionable ethics, arranged a tour of the public areas, noted entrances, exits, the private staircase that led to Holloway's office, the guard who remained at its base during business hours. I created an opportunity during a celebration marking the territorial anniversary, a night when the saloon would be crowded, when staff would be occupied with exceptional customer volume, when usual protocols might relax slightly amid the festivities. I arrived early, observed from a corner table, waited for the establishment to fill with miners, ranchers, businessmen, territorial officials, all enjoying subsidized drinks courtesy of Holloway's supposed civic generosity. When the piano player began a particularly rousing number that drew attention and participation, I moved casually toward the private staircase. The guard had stepped away momentarily to address a disturbance near the bar, the gap in security I had anticipated based on previous observations. I ascended quickly, reached the third floor without encounter, located Holloway's office using information provided unwittingly by the bartender during my tour. The door was locked, but yielded to techniques I had learned during my years of searching. A few moments with simple tools, a quiet click. Access granted. The office reflected its owner. Opulent, carefully arranged, designed to impress visitors with Holloway's success and taste. Leather furniture, original artwork, a desk that dominated the space, cabinets of polished wood along one wall, a concealed bar built into a bookcase. I moved directly to the desk, examined the drawers, found them locked, applied the same techniques, discovered correspondence arranged in meticulous order, business, documents separated from personal communications, everything categorized with the precision of a man who understood the value of information management. I found what I sought in the bottom drawer, a leather-bound ledger with unmarked cover. Inside were records of transactions spanning 15 years, names, dates, amounts, locations, each woman reduced to an entry, each sale documented with clinical detachment, the business of human suffering recorded for accounting purposes. Sarah's name appeared on a page dated June 18th, 1877. 3 days after our planned wedding date. Her entry was marked with an annotation, incomplete delivery, partial payment to Thornton, responsibility for loss assigned to transport team, the clinical documentation of my beloved's fate, of the life stolen from her, from us. I continued searching, located a metal box in a hidden compartment behind a painting. Inside were letters, detailed communications between Holloway and associates throughout the West, instructions for acquisition, transport, distribution, coded but clear to anyone familiar with the operation. damning in their specificity and Holloway's direct involvement. I did not take these items, did not risk their loss or questions about their provenance. Instead, I used paper from his own desk to document their location, their contents, their significance. I wrote clearly and comprehensively, created a map that would lead federal authorities directly to the evidence required for conviction. As I completed this task, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy and purposeful, I moved to the window, assessed the distance to the alley below, considered escape routes, decided against flight, against concealment, against anything that might suggest wrongdoing on my part. The door opened. Holloway entered, stopped abruptly at the sight of me seated at his desk. His hand moved toward his jacket where a weapon surely waited. I remained still, calm, my documentation complete on the desk before me. He recognized me, not as Josiah Kane, not as James Williams, but as the man who had systematically dismantled his operation over the preceding weeks. The man who had delivered Thornton and Porter to justice, the man who now sat surrounded by evidence of his crimes. He smiled thinly, asked what price would secure my cooperation, suggested a figure that represented more wealth than I had seen in my lifetime. When I did not respond, he doubled the offer, mentioned properties in San Francisco that could be transferred immediately, connections that could ensure prosperity and protection. I stood slowly, placed Sarah's diary on his desk beside my documentation, opened it to the final entry. Her last words written by failing candlelight in the mine shaft where she died, her expression of love for me, her hope that somehow the truth would emerge, her forgiveness of those who had harmed her. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He recognized my identity from the diary, connected me to the grieving bridegroom from 15 years earlier, realized negotiation was impossible, that he faced not an opportunist seeking profit, but an avenger seeking justice. He drew his pistol with surprising speed for a man of his age and station, aimed with the steadiness of experience. I did not flinch, did not plead, did not close my eyes. I had accomplished my purpose, had ensured Sarah's story would be known, had guaranteed that evidence of his crimes would reach authorities. My own survival was secondary to that achievement. The sound of multiple footsteps on the stairs interrupted the moment, voices calling Holloway's name, the entry of federal marshals with weapons drawn, the culmination of information I had provided through anonymous channels, the timing orchestrated to this precise moment of confrontation. Holloway assessed his options with the calculation of a man accustomed to evaluating risk. He placed his weapon on the desk, raised his hands with dignity, adopted the posture of the respected businessman unjustly accused, the role he had perfected over decades of criminal enterprise. I was questioned as well. My presence explained as an investigation into potential investment opportunities. My documentation described as notes regarding business practices I found concerning. My possession of Sarah's diary, attributed to historical research related to frontier violence. The marshals seized the ledger, the correspondence, the financial records, escorted Holloway from his office through the main floor of his establishment, past employees and patrons who watched in confused silence, into a waiting wagon that would transport him to federal custody in Phoenix. I provided formal statements, over subsequent days, presented Sarah's diary as evidence, directed authorities to the mine shaft where I had found it, watched as they recovered additional evidence Thornton revealed during questioning, observed the systematic dismantling of an operation that had claimed countless lives over 15 years. The territorial newspapers documented each development, the arrests, the evidence, the connections to respected citizens, the scope of the criminal enterprise. Sarah's story became a focal point of the coverage, her diary excerpts published with appropriate discretion, her fate presented as the human reality behind the clinical statistics. Holloway maintained his innocence through initial hearings, employed expensive legal representation, attempted to distance himself from Thornton and Porter, suggested he was the victim of a coordinated effort to seize his legitimate business interests. His defense collapsed when 7 women came forward, women who had escaped the fate intended for them, women who had rebuilt lives in distant communities, women who recognized this opportunity to reclaim their narratives and prevent future suffering. Their testimony, combined with the documentary evidence, ensured conviction was inevitable. The Sioux trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended each day, sat silently as testimony unfolded, witnessed Holloway's deterioration as former associates provided evidence against him, as financial records revealed the extent of his operation, as the human cost of his enterprise became impossible to deny. The verdict was delivered on October 12, 1892. Guilty on all counts, the sentence severe by territorial standards, confinement at Yuma Prison for the remainder of his natural life, all properties and assets seized, his name formally stricken from civic recognitions and records of contribution. I watched him led from the courthouse, his expensive suit replaced by prison garb, his confident posture diminished by the weight of shackles, his future reduced to a cell in one of the harshest penal institutions in the West, a man who had trafficked in stolen freedom, now permanently deprived of his own. The first snow fell on Prescott in early November, light flakes that melted upon contact with the ground, a gentle transition from autumn to winter. I stood on the porch of a small house I had purchased on the outskirts of town, watched the changing season with a sense of completion, of promise fulfilled. Sarah's diary had been returned to me following the trial. The territorial authorities recognized its personal significance beyond its evidentiary value. I handled it with reverence, read her words each evening before sleep, found comfort in the connection to her thoughts, her experiences, her enduring spirit. I had commissioned a proper headstone, had it placed near the entrance to the mine shaft where she spent her final hours. A simple marker with her name, her dates, and words taken from her final diary entry. Hope endures beyond darkness. Truth emerges through time. Love transcends all trials. I visited weekly, brought wildflowers when available, sat in contemplative silence, told her about developments in the case, about the women who had come forward, about the operation that had been permanently dismantled, about the men who would never harm another as they had harmed her. The territorial governor had offered a substantial reward for my role in exposing the criminal enterprise. I declined personal compensation, suggested the funds be directed toward establishing a women's shelter in Prescott, a place of safety and renewal for those who had suffered or been displaced, a legacy that honored Sarah's compassionate nature. William Porter was apprehended in Denver in December, attempting to board a train to Chicago under an assumed name. His trial was brief, his sentence comparable to his brother's, his future confined to the same institution as his former employers, the circle of accountability complete. I remained in Prescott through that winter, considered my path forward. The single-minded purpose that had driven me for 15 years had been fulfilled. Justice had been achieved, Sarah's story known, her suffering acknowledged, her memory honored. The question of what remained for me hung in the silence of my small home. I resumed carpentry, small projects initially, repairs for neighbors, furniture for the women's shelter, a communion table for the church. My hands remembered skills long neglected, found satisfaction in creation rather than destruction, in building rather than dismantling. In the spring, I received a letter from Sarah's cousin in Illinois. She had read newspaper accounts of the trial, of Sarah's fate, of my role in bringing the responsible parties to justice. She wrote of the family's gratitude, their admiration for my persistence, their comfort in finally knowing the truth after years of uncertainty. She also wrote of Sarah's childhood, stories I had never heard, the young girl who rescued injured birds, who excelled in school despite limited opportunities, who dreamed of becoming a teacher in the West, where education was still taking root. Memories that filled gaps in my understanding of the woman I had loved. With the letter came a small package. Inside was a locket, silver with delicate engravings, one of the family heirlooms Sarah had traveled to Illinois to collect. Her cousin had kept it safe all these years, had wanted me to have it as a connection to what might have been, as acknowledgement of what had been lost. The locket contained a small portrait, Sarah at perhaps 20 years of age, her expression serious but with warmth in her eyes. Her hair arranged simply, her dress modest but becoming. The image captured her essence in a way my fading memories could not, the physical reality of the woman for whom I had sought justice. I placed the locket in the wooden box I had carved. For her, 18 years earlier, the box that had remained empty since her departure. The first gift I had given her now housed the last I would receive in her name. A completion of a circle begun in hope and closed in resolution. As summer approached, I made a decision. I would leave Prescott. The town held too many shadows, too many reminders, too many ghosts. I would seek a new beginning elsewhere, not to escape the past, but to honor it by embracing possibility again, by attempting to build the life that Sarah would have wanted for me. I chose California, the coastal communities north of San Francisco, where forests met ocean, where I could apply my carpentry skills to new challenges, where the air carried the scent of possibility rather than dust and memory, where no one knew me as either the grieving bridegroom or the determined avenger. Before departing, I visited Sarah's marker one final time, placed wildflowers beneath her name, spoke aloud the words I had carried in my heart for 15 years, told her of my love that had never diminished, my sorrow at our lost future, my gratitude for having known her, if only briefly, my hope that I had honored her memory through my actions. I told her I was moving forward but not leaving her behind, that she remained part of me, that the justice achieved in her name had created space for healing, that I would attempt to live with the same courage and dignity she had shown in her final days. I departed Prescott in June 1893, traveled by train to California, established myself in a small community where redwoods grew within sight of the Pacific, purchased land, built a workshop, began creating furniture known for its beauty and craftsmanship. I did not seek companionship initially, did not believe myself capable of opening my heart after so many years focused on vengeance. But time and distance created possibility. The woman who commissioned a dining table for her boarding house returned to discuss additional pieces. Our conversations extended beyond business. Her laughter reminded me of the capacity for joy I had once known. 2 years after arriving in California, I built a home large enough for a family, extended an invitation that was accepted with genuine affection, created a life that honored the past while embracing the future, found purpose in creation, in connection, in the quiet moments between sunset and darkness when gratitude outweighed grief. I kept Sarah's diary and locket secure in the carved box. Sometimes weeks passed without opening it. Sometimes I read her words by firelight and introduced her memory to my new family. Her story became part of our shared narrative, her courage an inspiration rather than a wound. I am 63 now. My hands show the wear of decades of craftsmanship. My hair has turned completely white. My shoulders carry the weight of experiences both painful and precious. I have lived 2 distinct lives, one defined by loss and pursuit of justice, one characterized by rebuilding and reconciliation. I do not know which version of myself Sarah would recognize if she could see me now, the devoted bridegroom prepared to build a life with her, the determined avenger who dismantled the lives of those who harmed her, the craftsman who found his way back to creation after years of destruction. Perhaps she would see elements of all three, the continuum of a single life shaped by both love and loss. If what I know with certainty is this: truth emerges through time. Justice may be delayed, but need not be denied. Healing comes not from forgetting, but from honoring memory while choosing to embrace life again. Sarah understood this in her final moments. It has taken me much longer to learn the same lesson. Her story is known now, recorded in territorial histories, mentioned in accounts of frontier justice. Her name remembered not only as a victim, but as the catalyst for exposing a criminal enterprise that had claimed countless lives. The quiet schoolteacher whose diary brought powerful men to accountability. I will join her eventually. My instructions are clear. My remains to be laid near her marker at Devil's Canyon. United in death, as we were prevented from being in life. But until that day arrives, I will continue to honor her memory through living with purpose, through creating beauty from raw materials, through believing, as she wrote in her final hours, that hope endures beyond darkness. That is her legacy, and mine, and the truth that emerged from 15 years of searching.